It has become known what the United States of America offered dictator Putin as conditions for ending Russia's war against Ukraine. In Moscow, they stated that they received the latest proposal from the Americans regarding a peace agreement in Ukraine and added that they agree with some points and negotiations can be held. And today, the media gained access to the very proposals that Steve Witkoff handed over to dictator Putin from Donald Trump yesterday. In fact, these proposals are very similar to the so-called Korean scenario. It's a ceasefire instead of peace. A frozen conflict, no de jure recognition of the occupied territories, but freezing their discussion for many years. But most importantly, there are no promises about Ukraine not joining NATO or reducing military aid to Ukraine. Nevertheless, on the eve, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly stated that a future deal could be beneficial for Ukraine, but Kiev would have to make territorial concessions. And Donald Trump suggested that Putin might agree to peace if the issue of exchanging territories is discussed. Which territories exactly is still an open question. Let's discuss together these conditions that have appeared in the media today. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 7th. Let's go through everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So today, the representative of the dictator Putin, Ushakov, stated that the Kremlin received some kind of proposal from the United States regarding ending the war against Ukraine, which the Kremlin is ready to consider, but only at a personal meeting between Trump and Putin. By the way, we will discuss the topic of the meeting between Trump, Putin and Zelensky in detail in the next episode, since this is a separate topic that deserves special attention. The Kremlin insists on a meeting between Trump and Putin without Zelensky, but as for Trump, one of the conditions for such a meeting was the demand that the Russian dictator actually meet with Zelensky and stop avoiding such a meeting. In this episode, we'll focus on the conditions that the United States has conveyed to the Kremlin. And today, the Polish publication ONET writes that the meeting between the United States President's Special Representative Steve Witkoff and Russian President Vladimir Putin, which took place on Wednesday, was likely the last straw in Donald Trump's current policy toward Moscow. According to ONET, Witkoff discussed the United States' proposal for a ceasefire with Russia, which was coordinated with European powers. And this is an important point. That is, it shows that Trump is coordinating all proposals with Zelensky and Putin. Let me remind you, before Witkoff's visit to Moscow, Trump called Zelensky and European leaders, and a similar call took place right after Witkoff left Moscow. So, as they say, the coordination is obvious. And according to ONET, Moscow received a very favorable offer from the Trump administration, although there is a hint that Ukraine will be forced to make concessions. There are also proposals that are more favorable to Ukraine and guarantee a long-term truce. I emphasize, it is already known that Russia and the United States have agreed that a meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump will take place in the coming days. This was reported by the advisor to the President of Russia, Yuri Ushakov, in fact as early as next week. And the White House has confirmed that Trump gave the order to quickly organize such a meeting. As ONET writes, a possible refusal by Moscow of Trump's proposal would mean that even the most pro-Moscow politicians in Washington would have to finally lose any illusions about the possibility of reaching any kind of compromise agreement with Russia. So the American proposals include a ceasefire in Ukraine or a truce, but not the establishment of a permanent peace. Even in Washington, they don't believe in this. Although there is a certain trap in this, because let me remind you, there is also no peace between North and South Korea. They still have only a truce. In fact, there is an armistice agreement between North and South Korea, which was signed on July 27, 1953. This agreement ended the active fighting of the Korean War, but a peace treaty has not been signed to this day. Therefore, formally, the conflict between the two sides continues to this day. And Trump is proposing the same scheme to Ukraine and Russia, and there's a trap in this. For example, the Armistice document between South and North Korea outlines issues such as the ceasefire, the determination of the demarcation line, and the creation of a demilitarized zone. In practice, all this meant that the line separating the troops simply became the new border for decades to come. Based on this, we see the second point of Trump's proposal, which is mentioned by the Polish publication ONET, the de facto recognition of Russia's territorial gains. That is, Ukraine de facto, but not de jure, recognizes the occupation of the territories. And both sides commit to not discussing this issue for 49 or even 99 years. In fact, this is a freezing of the war. If this works, the United States promises to lift most of the sanctions imposed against Russia and in the long term to resume energy cooperation, meaning the import of Russian gas and oil. But for the latter to happen, Russia must demonstrate a truly long-term ceasefire. If Russia acts aggressively during the ceasefire, there will be no energy cooperation. Now, here are two very interesting points. The package of proposals does not include a guarantee of no NATO expansion, which the Russians constantly demand. Washington states directly that the Kremlin will never receive such a guarantee of Ukraine's neutrality. And also Moscow did not receive a promise to stop military support for Ukraine. Washington stated that fulfilling all the previous points is only possible if the West continues to provide Ukraine with all necessary military support as a guarantee of security against possible future Russian aggression. And what's notable is that according to ONET, the Russian side supposedly accepts the last point. Well, I don't know how exactly Putin is going to explain the demilitarization of Ukraine to the Russian herd if he agrees to continued military aid to Ukraine. The possibility of reaching an agreement is confirmed by statements from at least several leading European politicians. For example, as ONET writes, on July 30th, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk stated, and I quote, "There are good chances and many signs indicating that the Russian-Ukrainian war may, at the very least, be suspended in the near future." In turn, Czech President Petr Pavel recently stated in an interview with the British Broadcasting Corporation, and I quote, "If the price of Ukraine's survival is the occupation of part of the country by Russia, then that is an acceptable price." Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski was also asked about the proposal details. To a specific question about the possibility of resuming energy cooperation with Russia, he replied, and I quote, "This war will end someday. And Russia has been a source of raw materials for the European Union for centuries." Well, kind of hinting that this could resume. The above statement by Sikorski, although quite diplomatic and not very specific, actually confirms the information that the proposals presented by the Americans are very far-reaching. Although, earlier in this episode I wondered how Putin would explain to the Russian herd the halt of the war without achieving all the goals of the special military operation. You remember, don't you? I have an answer. The day before, Trump gave the order to move 2 nuclear submarines closer to Russia, and in Russia they announced the deployment of intermediate and shorter-range missiles. All of this looked like preparation for supposedly inevitable mutual nuclear strikes. So the chances of reaching an agreement are now higher than they were yesterday. And paradoxically, the growing tension between Washington and Moscow, including these mutual nuclear threats, also points to this. And now, as they say, watch closely. If a peace agreement on Ukraine had been reached in the form described by ONET, Trump would have had to make significant concessions to Russia, and Putin would have had to agree to end the war without achieving all the stated goals of the special military operation. That's why it's beneficial for both of them to make it clear that they were the ones who did it. They took these steps in the face of the threat of a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia, and thus supposedly saved the planet from nuclear war. So, in other words, the growing tension, contrary to what might seem logical, actually indicates that an agreement is more likely to be close than far off. On the other hand, Donald Trump gave Putin a deadline until August 8 to end the war, threatening to impose so-called secondary sanctions if the war continues. That is, sanctions against third countries, in this case punitive tariffs for countries that buy Russian oil and gas. The introduction of secondary sanctions would mean the cessation of Russian raw material exports and would inevitably lead to the collapse of the Russian economy and budget. And here the nerve game appears again. Just like with nuclear weapons, The thing is, Moscow predicts that Trump is bluffing and will not impose the aforementioned restrictions. Washington in turn assumes that it's Moscow who's bluffing and is actually genuinely afraid of these sanctions. But, I just have to point out that the proposal put forward by ONED is much worse for the Kremlin than what was offered to the Russians in March-April, which Putin refused. That's why it's hard to believe that the Kremlin has already agreed to such a proposal. But it's possible that Putin is ready to play along with Trump and stall for time. Putin may once again play with the American president, using diplomatic maneuvers as a stalling tactic. Long-standing skepticism in Washington regarding the Kremlin's intentions has only intensified after Russia's recent attacks on Ukrainian cities, which have been some of the most intense since the start of the full-scale war. And, sometimes we just underestimate how interested the Kremlin is in continuing this war, because the regime of dictator Putin is now surviving economically, politically, and ideologically precisely on the idea of continuing the war, which they call some kind of sacred war. Now it's hard to imagine, when the war ends and the goals of the special military operation are not achieved, how will Putin's regime survive and get out of this situation? At the same time, it's worth noting the statement by United States Secretary of State Mark Rubio, quote, "The key element in ending the war is territorial issues. Both Russians and Ukrainians must make concessions, which is difficult. Ukrainians have paid a huge price in this war, and these concessions are not easy to present to their people." Well, I think everyone wants to end the war. There is still a lot of work ahead, and I don't want to exaggerate, but today we are definitely closer to the goal than we were yesterday. Now, for the first time, we have specific things that Russia has requested in order to end this war. We didn't have that before. Now, at least, we have an understanding of what they are demanding. This may not be something that Ukraine can accept, but at least it gives us an outline of what we need to work on. Now, at least, we have something to work with. And after that, Bloomberg reported that Trump told Zelensky and the allies that Putin might start peace talks in exchange for discussing the issue of territorial swaps. But then the New York Times writes that, according to their sources, Putin's main demand is not so much territorial concessions as Ukraine's refusal to join NATO, limiting Ukraine's military potential. And that Putin is negotiating to discuss an exchange for Ukrainian territory. So friends, in the next episode we will discuss with you the topic of the upcoming meeting between Trump and Putin. I'll leave it at that for now. Write your opinion in the comments, your conclusions about these proposals that were supposedly voiced by the Americans to the Kremlin, and what kind of game the dictator Putin will start playing now. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.